So welcome to this thematic track on mobilizing finance for adaptation. This is supported by the Department of International Development UK. So in this track, we will be dealing with the need for mobilizing finance. As we all know, there's an increased appetite for accelerated adaptation action across the countries. In this context, the major challenge is finance, mobilizing finance and bringing together multiple stakeholders. So this panel will deliberate on the various channels by which options can be manipulated and options can be mobilized for bringing across adequate opportunities, and also serve as a platform where multiple stakeholders can interact and talk about the need. So the increase in extreme events, climatic disasters has indeed pointed the need for accelerated adaptation action. So in this context, to set the framework, I invite Anna French, Deputy Country Head, UK Department for International Development.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so much interest here this afternoon. Climate change is one of the biggest global threats to sustained development. The scale of this risk was starkly set out again at this year's World Economic Forum. The leaders were surveyed for the latest edition of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, and environmental threats dominate the list for the third year in a row, both in terms of impact and also of likelihood. Extreme weather events top the list of the most likely risks and come third for impact. And failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation is in second place on both the lists. The recent IPCC report highlighted the impacts of a 1.5 degree warming and the challenge of reducing emissions to stay below that. The UK Met Office has just released a report showing that the world is in the middle of what is likely to be the warmest 10 years since records began in 1850. But I'm sure those in Delhi at the moment who are feeling those very cold mornings might not see it quite that way, but that's how it's been seen anyway, more generally. And in the next 5 years, there is a chance we'll see a year in which the average global temperature could be greater than 1.5 degrees warming. While this will be a temporary increase, the fact that this can happen now shows we are getting close to that really critical threshold. There is therefore an urgent need to transform how the world tackles adaptation and building resilience. The UK is prioritising climate resilience in all of our development partnerships, but we need others to come with us. The international system is still too heavily weighted towards reacting to crises after the event. And the UK has committed to lead action to drive up awareness and mobilise action to build climate resilience, using UK leadership of the Climate Resilience Agenda at the UN Secretary-General's Climate Summit in September later this year. This will be a key moment to galvanise and accelerate action on climate change. The world needs to fundamentally change the way in which it invests to secure resilience to a changing climate through future-proofing investments and also creating environments that allow finance to flow where the adaptation needs are the greatest. Globally, the annual costs of adaptation, and these are just some shocking figures, could range from US 140 billion to US 300 billion through 2030, and including costs to build resilience to future climate risks over the lifetime of a given investment will significantly add up costs. With the exception of a few niche emerging opportunities, commercial business models that address adaptation remains very limited. But the other thing I wanted to say is in the UK, we also recognise that lifting 1 billion people out of poverty and addressing global challenges like climate change will take far more than global development budgets can ever provide. To deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN says we are going to need to attract trillions of dollars a year in investments from government and also, crucially, from the private sector. So that's why we need to talk about the Beyond Aid agenda here today, acknowledging that while aid is still necessary, it's not sufficient in its finance either for the next development leap in its scale or in its nature. The session today on mobilizing finance for adaptation will look at the climate finance landscape of South Asia and the need for a collaborative effort by public and private sector in overcoming the barriers slowing the action on climate change. Today's session is co-convened by two major adaptation programs supported by DFID, which explore tools, approaches, and challenges in financing climate-resilient development across South Asia. More specifically, and the presenters, and they'll get introduced to you in a minute, and the panelists will share their perspectives on the issue, how the government and private sector across South Asia is responding to climate adaptation, what are the most critical challenges and opportunities, and what role partners can play. So I want to thank all of the presenters, all of the organisers, the panellists, and the audience for their participation in today's session. And particularly, I also just wanted to thank Terry for their support in this too. Thanks.
Now I invite Dr. Aditya Vibhadu, Regional Development Manager of the ACT program of the DFID.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aditya, and I serve as the Regional Program Development Manager of the Action on Climate Today program. This is a 5-year initiative funded by DFID and managed by Oxford Policy Management. We work in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India at the central level, and in 6 states, in Nepal and Bangladesh, to provide direct technical assistance to governments on 4 sectoral themes on adaptation, which include agriculture, water, climate finance, and governance. And we have a cross-cutting regional strategy that is focused on learning, sharing, coordinating, and amplifying the impacts of this program. The program ends in 6 weeks from now. So 5 years have flown, and it's a pleasure to be here today to be sharing some lessons from this program on adaptation finance with you all. But some of the key outputs of this program include the fact that the program has climate-proofed 80+ policies, plans, and governance systems. We've developed 27 proposals for climate finance across the geographies where we worked, and trained over 2,000 government officials on mainstreaming adaptation and accessing and managing climate finance. This has led to us shaping nearly $1 billion for climate resilient development over the course of the last 5 years, and consolidating 18 high-level policies and improving 15 governance systems, and we'll get into examples of all these now, and my colleague Vidya will talk about them in greater detail going forward. The headline message is that over the past 4 years, we've helped access $1.2 billion for climate resilient growth in South Asia, and that's why we're here. I'm very excited to be part of this panel on financing adaptation. This includes a substantial chunk of Green Climate Fund money, where we worked with the governments of Afghanistan, Pakistan, as well as in India, where we helped support the proposal from Odisha to secure this money from the Green Climate Fund, as well as a large chunk of money mobilized from domestic budgets, which is what we'll focus on predominantly in our interventions today, as well as working with the private sector and multilateral organizations to ensure that their investments are serving the needs of adaptation. So I was asked to perform a magic trick here today by crunching down our insights from a 5-year program running across 12 geographies in 5 countries in 10 minutes. So I've decided to distill it down into what are the 5 key things that we've learned on adaptation finance. And hopefully Vidya will then color these broad insights with more detail in the panel discussion that will follow. So the first thing is, mobilizing domestic finance is vital to make sustainable gains for resilience. As Anna rightly highlighted in her introductory remarks, the scale of financing needed to ameliorate the loss and damage that climate change is going to bring is so vast that even under the most optimistic financing scenarios, international climate finance is simply not going to be enough to deal with the expected and uncertain impacts of climate change. And therefore, domestic finance from countries' own domestic budgets is absolutely vital. Many vital sectors that are likely to suffer at the hands of climate change are ignored by international climate finance. A review, for instance, of adaptation proposals funded through GCF, which are anyway a minority of the total money that the GCF has dispersed, will lead to an understanding that this money is going to a few key sectors, whereas many other sectors that are actually going to suffer are not receiving international climate finance. Hence, we need to consider domestic finance more seriously. Also, the unfortunate reality is that international climate finance still tends to be in the form of projects, whereas there is a vital need to mainstream climate finance for adaptation in governance processes and in business as usual, and again, therefore, this is the reason why domestic finance is vitally important. The ACT program has been doing this across most of the location where it works, using something called the Financing Framework for Resilient Growth. This is a 4-step process that allows us to mainstream adaptation finance into government's own budgets. It starts with a simple economic impact assessment of climate change, where we determine the amount of damage that climate change is going to cause to a country's economy, or to a state's economy, or to a sectoral economy. We then go on to examine the degree to which current spending by a country, state, or sector is already delivering benefits for adaptation. For instance, if you're spending 100 rupees on irrigation, 30 rupees or so of that delivers an adaptation benefit, because one of the impacts of climate change will be water scarcity, and an irrigation program helps deal with that. So we've got an established methodology for climate budgeting, which helps us determine the degree to which budgets are supporting adaptation. This allows us to determine how much economic impact climate change is going to have, how much money is currently being spent, so that we understand the gap in adaptation financing. The final step is, once we know the money that is needed, we then go about filling this adaptation gap in a number of different ways. It could include prioritizing those budget expenditure options that are delivering high adaptation benefits, mobilizing money from the private sector, securing money from the Green Climate Fund, et cetera, et cetera. And we've run these processes in deep partnership with government from locations from Afghanistan to Assam, and some very interesting and unique results have come from this. And I think, Vidya, you'll talk about this process as unfolded in Assam and Odisha and such processes and what they've delivered. So, key lesson being, domestic finance is vital, and mainstreaming adaptation finance in domestic budgets is absolutely essential. This is not to say that international climate finance doesn't still play a vital catalytic role. We worked on both sides of the adaptation finance spectrum, on the domestic and international finance side, and we find that even though the total quantum of resources being mobilized by international climate finance will not be enough to offset the damages that climate change is going to bring, we find that it provides crucial incentives for government to engage in policy reform on adaptation. We find that it opens the door for wider institutional development. It is the carrot that that governments need in order to mainstream adaptation across their plans, programs, and budgets. But the issue is that to mobilize international climate finance, we need substantial technical expertise. To just give you an example of the third point, in Afghanistan, where we've established and run the climate finance unit that is housed within the Ministry of Environment, they've just secured, Afghanistan has just got its first grant from the GCF, which is $300,000 for readiness funds. And it took at least 27 back and forths with the Green Climate Fund, 27 revisions to the proposal for them to secure this grant. So one of the challenges with securing international climate finance is, especially for LDCs, that a large amount of technical expertise is needed. But again, of course, there are key positives with international climate finance. And in Odisha, we found, for instance, working closely with the government on developing the GCF proposal on groundwater led to a whole range of policy reform opportunities, from climate budgeting in the water sector to local level adaptation planning. This helped move the discourse forward tangibly. The third lesson is that investments in adaptation must spring from an understanding of impacts. While doing this analysis across 7 or 8 locations with governments, we found that a particular sector is suffering damages from climate change, but it's other sectors that seem to be attracting adaptation finance. So there is a misalignment between sectors that receive adaptation funding and those that suffer impacts. And this inaccurate targeting leads to slow or no gains for vulnerability reduction, and structured climate change impact assessments are therefore essential and must be the starting point for adaptation planning and adaptation finance investments. I know I'm coming close to exhausting my 10 minutes, so I'm going to race through the last 2 points. The fourth key lesson is that building institutional capabilities is of paramount importance for ensuring sustainable gains from adaptation financing. Climate finance still continues to suffer from the fly-in, fly-out consultancy model, which is not helpful over the long term. And I can see Claire smiling because we've had this discussion many times. And we at the Action on Climate Today program like to think that we've adopted an approach which is different. In the beginning of the presentation, I said we've trained close to 2,000 government officials on various aspects of climate finance. Almost 1,300 of these officials have been trained in accessing and managing climate finance. So the easy way out is you fly in a few consultants who write a GCF proposal, but the more difficult way is to build sustainable institutional capacity within governments to do this both on accessing international climate finance and mainstreaming climate finance in domestic budgets. And therefore, governments must have the ability to mainstream climate change in their budgets. Now, I'd like to take a minute to discuss how we've done this in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In both these locations, our program has worked closely with governments in establishing climate finance units. In Pakistan, this is housed within the Ministry of Climate Change, and in Afghanistan, within the National Environment Protection Agency. Both units are an agglomeration of external consultants from our program, but predominantly staffed by government staff. And over the course of 3 or 4 years of the running, we found that skills transfer has taken place, and these institutions have become sustainable from a financing point of view and from a human resources point of view, where government staff now has the capability to access this financing. To be entirely honest, it would have been easier for us to fly in a few international consultants, work with Pakistan and Afghanistan on quickly writing our GCF proposals and fly out. But developing the sustainable institution within government, we feel over the long term will have a transformational impact, and I don't use that word lightly, on the climate finance landscape of these two countries. The final lesson is that understanding the political economy of climate finance is absolutely crucial. Integrating climate finance into domestic budgets, like much of PFM reform, is slow and painful. It takes a lot of work to get governments to trust you to a point where they can open up their budgets for you to review and start having a meaningful discussion on financial allocations. We found that aligning with prevailing policy narratives is absolutely essential to gaining any traction on domestic financing. For example, in Assam, we found that talking about adaptation finance was very difficult, whereas the government was extremely interested in making progress on sustainable development goals. So we used a discussion of sustainable development goals and financing sustainable development goals as an entry point to making the government understand that we're essentially talking about the same thing, and that working on adaptation finance will help them meet their sustainable development goal targets as well. And ensuring that the most vulnerable benefit from domestic and international climate finance is not a given, and it takes a lot of priming, training, and discussion. And our program has taken, rather than imbibing this only as a principle, we've actually taken tangible measures to make sure that we're mapping and understanding and aligning with local political economies of the locations where we work in. One of the things that we do is annual context assessments that are fairly rigorous and map what are the prevailing policy narratives, who are the key people that need to be influenced, what are the political dimensions of the adaptation debate across the 12 locations where we work, to ensure that our work gains traction and is aligned with the government's own priorities. So there you have it. I think I've tried to pull a rabbit out of the hat, and it's a big 5-year a technical assistance project on adaptation mainstreaming, but this is the pith of what we've learned on working with 12 governments on adaptation financing. Vidya is going to do the difficult bit and illustrate all these 5 points with examples from the locations where we worked, which will add richness to the narrative, and I can hear the alarm going, so I will hand it back to, am I handing it to Claire now? Oh, to Koel.
Thank you, Aditya. Now I invite Mr. Koel Mandal. He's a climate change expert of infrastructure for climate resilient growth from IPE Global.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think what we are all trying to talk about today is how do you access and mobilize finances for climate change adaptation. There's a growing evidence now that mainstreaming of climate change into development programs is a more effective way of addressing climate change. And that's what we heard from the previous two speakers. And one of the main reasons for this is that you have access to a dedicated source of finance, which is domestic public finance. And what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so is our experience in trying to do so, in trying to mainstream climate change with one of the biggest social protection programs in the world, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. In doing so, I'll raise certain questions which we generally ask of in the context of climate finance. I'll try and answer some ways in which we have addressed these questions, and then finally leave you with some additional food for thought and questions. The program that we implement is called the Infrastructure for Climate Resilient Growth. It's a 4-year technical assistance program, bilateral cooperation project between the UK's Department for International Development, DFID, and the Ministry of Rural Development at the center. In the interest of time, I would assume that all of you know what the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act is all about, MGNREGA. In short, it provides 100 days of guaranteed labor to any rural household that's willing to do so. And the vehicle by which it does so are what is called works, or rural infrastructure. And most of this infrastructure is in the domain of natural resource management. So irrigation infrastructure, for example, irrigation canals, land development, plantation projects. So people volunteer to do work, and they get paid for building assets such as the ones I just mentioned. So if you look at the budget for MGNREGA, I think the government of India on average spends around $6 billion US every year. That's the expenditure on MGNREGA. Now, I think the question is sort of how much of this can you call as a climate expenditure? And there was a 2012 Ministry of Finance paper, I think, the first of its kind that the ministry came out with, that not only MGNREGA, but all such development programs were clubbed as adaptation spend, India's adaptation spend. And I think a number of around 2.6% of India's GDP was tagged to be on adaptation in India. And this was a high number, and a lot of people sort of started raising questions at that point. And subsequently, of course, we have come up with more nuanced methodologies like the ones Aditya mentioned, which takes a more sort of development adaptation continuum approach, So, of course, we have a lot of these more nuanced analysis now that does coding of government expenditure. What I will now talk about is how have we, as a program, the ICRG program, how have we tried to mainstream climate change into MGNREGA? One sort of key intervention that we have is we are trying to use long-term climate projection data to influence decision in the way that the scheme chooses its infrastructure and designs its infrastructure. So right now it's all, the spirit of the program is supposed to be demand-based, right? So Gram Panchayat or a block, the units of decision-making, people decide in a meeting what kind of infrastructure they would like to be planned and built in that area for the next 1 or 2 years, right? And that's how the planning happens. What we are trying to do is we have, in the 103 blocks that the program works, we have done a climate modeling projection, basically, 2020 to 2050, and we have done a vulnerability assessment of the current scenario. And we are trying to use this set of data in understanding whether this could influence the choice of works. So for example, if before we intervened with our data, if people chose roads, dug wells, for example, after you give this data on future droughts, floods, will their decision change? Will they choose something that is more, or potentially will deliver more climate resilience? So that's the first aspect. Does data change planning? And we have a set of recommendations, of course, block-wise recommendations based on climate projections for each block, that this is the set of choices that you ought to make if climate resilience were to be enhanced. The second thing that we are trying to do is, once you have a choice of infrastructure, how does your design change to make the infrastructure itself more resilient? So one of the things that you would see worldwide is people are moving towards projected data on rainfall, for example, on peak intensity, one-day intensity, to design engineering structures. So that's something we're trying to include in the ICRG program, that the structures you're building, can you use future data as opposed to past data, which engineering is used to, in order to enhance the physical resilience, the structural resilience of these projects. So this is the central intervention that we do through the ICRG program. And of course, around this, we have a series of other interventions in terms of training and capacity building, IT-based systemic change, strengthening the institutions of MNREGA, and also at the state level through different institutes, technical as well as management institutes. So this is how the program is designed. Now, so far, we are in the third year of the program now. We have influenced some 19 million pounds worth of government domestic expenditure, which is supposed to go for MNREGA implementation anyway. And this is what we are saying, that we have been able to bring this expenditure into climate change. This is just through the MGNREGA scheme. And in addition to that, we have also been able to mobilize finances through convergence with other departments. So a simple example of convergence would be, for example, we do land development work through MGNREGA, and the seeds for the beneficiaries, the drought-resistant seeds, for example, will come from a different department, agriculture department, for example, or horticulture department. So this is what we call convergence, and we are seeing more and more examples, not just in our program, but even the way government is implementing its program. And this is something we're trying to promote. So we have been able to mobilize around 2 million pounds of additional finances from other relevant line departments, relevant schemes, into this program. So overall, the last number we have come up with is around 21 million pounds domestic public expenditure that we have been able to bring into climate change. And of course, being a sort of resource and time constrained project, we focus only on infrastructure in this project, but there are a number of other ways you could enhance resilience, right? A study by IIED, for example, as part of ICRG, has come up with a number of other recommendations on how you can enhance resilience. Wages, for example, is another area. Right now, MGNREGA gives additional 50 days, so from 100 to 150 in case there is a drought declared in the area. So one of the recommendations, for example, is instead of making it a reactive mechanism, which it is currently, can you make it a proactive mechanism? You know, can you, in expectation or anticipation of disaster or climate event, can you already announce additional number of days? So that's one recommendation. There are recommendations on skills, for example. From the private sector side, can you use MNREGA work towards paying off insurance premium? So there are different other recommendations in addition to infrastructure intervention that could enhance your resilience. So I think given this context now, the other question that we asked is, what is the additional spending that's required in making MGNREGA more climate resilient, and where do you get that additional funds from? That's the other question, I think, in the previous presentation as well, we are trying to ask. So, of course, there are two components to additionality here. One is the software component, all the trainings, the capacity building tools, the data and knowledge on climate vulnerability that we are providing, the softer side of it, and the harder part, the implementation of the infrastructure itself. So ICRG model, what we have done is the softer elements come through the DFID support, through the International Climate Funds, the ICF support that we receive. And most of the tools and data has been provided from support of the program. And the actual implementation has happened through MGNREGA funds and convergence funds. Now going ahead, I think we are also thinking about if you were to scale this approach up to other states, to the entire country, what could be the potential funding sources? The National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change is, of course, one source. And the program is trying to develop one proposal for NAFCC, a regional proposal looking at 3 states, where you could replicate a similar approach for additional states. I think sort of this presentation follows nicely from sort of Aditya's presentation on the approaches to doing sort of mainstreaming climate change, and ICRG being a real example of how we have tried that with the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. The 1 or 2 questions that I would want to leave you with is, first, we have, of course, tried a certain approach to mainstreaming, like I mentioned. Are there other ways, interventions to which you could do mainstreaming that would enhance the resilience even further in Manrega? Second, what are the potential other sources, Green Climate Fund, private sources, to replicate something like the ICRG program of mainstreaming climate change into Manrega? And this is important because MGNREG is just one of the many central government development programs that the country has. And if you were able to find a way to sort of mainstream this and gather the additional funds for implementing this kind of a program, I think the implications for, in terms of real impact on the ground, is quite huge. So I'll end my talk with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Koil. We now have a panel discussion. The panel discussion will be moderated by Ms. Claire Shakya. She is the director of the Climate Change Group, IIED. I also invite the panelists, Ms. Vidya Soundararajan, Shri Sunil Kumar, Ms. Sangeeta Agarwal, Mr. Charanjit Singh, and Ms. Nanki Ko to the dais.
Great. Thank you. So after those 3 presentations to start us off, we've got a really exciting panel here. We started slightly late, so I'm going to try and keep everyone to slightly shorter, punchier remarks so that we can have some interaction with the audience. So we started with Anna setting out the scale of the challenge we're facing right now. 1.5 report has really shown us how little time we've got to act and how fast the climate impacts are coming already. And the climate finance itself will never be enough. Even if you take the whole development aid, that's not going to be enough. We really need to shift how the entire set of finance investments happens. And luckily, we have a panel here who's going to help us understand from a number of different perspectives actually how we do that. We're not starting from scratch. So we heard from Act today from Aditya about a really clever way of working with governments to build those capabilities within the national institutions themselves so we can move away from the fly-in, fly-out TA. We also heard from Koil about if you take the largest development investment globally, the NREG scheme, and begin to understand how you can bring climate information in ways that change decisions or change the design of a program or even change how the program is delivered, you could start to get greater resilience outcomes. So we've got too little money. We know we need to work with others in order to increase the amount of finance. We also know that a lot of the previous ways of working with climate finance hasn't really worked. So this fly-in, fly-out technical assistance, a lot we heard from the example of Afghanistan, and I think we'll hear some more examples. But we know that when the expertise comes from outside, writes the NDC, for example, the climate plan for a country, and then flies out again, it really doesn't leave very much ownership or very much understanding of what's in that plan. So we in IID have been running a process with a number of different countries, the least developed countries, but also a number of progressive countries that are really thinking this through at the moment. And there are some different ways of delivering, and some of that comes from the examples that we already heard. Learning from experience, we really need to think about the long-term institutional mechanisms by which we can begin to shift the other flows of finance. And if we think about those mechanisms as ones that need to reach the frontier, that where the communities are facing climate change and helping them adapt, then we can begin to get to real scale. And there are three principles that seem to emerge from looking at a huge range of examples. One is that you really need to focus on tackling the underlying drivers of vulnerability, whether that's chronic poverty, resource degradation, or climate change. And in fact, communities see those three issues together. So when they're put in the driving seat, they're looking to deliver a triple win that addresses poverty, increases resilient development, and tackles climate change and the degradation of forests or the high emission development. But secondly, they're looking for flexible and agile institutions that can work with them and allow them to pivot as things change. So the context is constantly changing at that local level. And thirdly, they need to be working with partners who are prepared to let the decision happen at the lowest possible level. So you take that decision as close to the community that's addressing climate change as possible. And obviously, if it's a landscape, there are some decisions that need to be taken higher. At a national level, there are other decisions that need to be taken at that level. But the idea of subsidiarity, getting it as low as possible. So looking at this experience, we've also found that you need to get the mechanisms fit for purpose. So if your purpose is to build local public goods, as we heard from NREGs, you need to design an approach that actually works with government systems, builds on what's already there, and works with the bottom-up planning process. But if you're trying to support enterprise, we need to provide climate information, but also the finance in ways that actually help them pivot and grow that business. And in most of the poorest countries of the world, 90% or more of jobs are actually in that sector. So unless we're beginning to get to those small enterprises in cleverer ways, we're missing most of where the green jobs could potentially lie. And then finally, the household, and the NREG's example gives a good example of that. There are some households that are always going to be left behind. So keeping those types of, what type of mechanism do we need for what purpose in mind, we're going to go to the speakers. So first, we're going to start with Vidya. Vidya's Soundarajan, I don't know why I'm having trouble with your name, I've known you for years, is the India Programme Head for ACT Today. And if you could tell us a little bit about what the challenges are to mainstreaming. So when we're looking at the government budget and trying to get the whole government budget to start to shift to more climate resilient outcomes, what are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities?
Thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be fairly brief, and I'll build on what you heard from Aditya and Koel in sort of in greater detail. So, and I'm going to focus more on subnational budget. So our program essentially looked at mainstreaming climate change into domestic budgets, because climate change not necessarily is the priority in plans and budgets, and there isn't enough spending happening on adaptation per se. There is still a decent amount of funding happening towards mitigation, and there is obviously market forces have taken up. So our programmatic challenge was to bring the climate change adaptation as a priority area in departmental, ministerial budgets of urban development, in sort of roads and bridges, agriculture department, water department, and various departments where climate change adaptation does not even feature as a core thematic area or a subject that they even consider important for their own perspective. So I would say our primary challenges were sort of in three stages. The first stage, when you actually sit across the government and talk to them and get them to be convinced of the fact that they should start considering climate change impact. So one of the things that really helped us, and I will take an Odisha example, is Odisha is one of the states that has in India, been implementing state level action plan on climate change. They do have specific funding mechanisms for more mitigation and adaptation, but to still enhance that spending to make more budget available within water resources department or within agricultural department, we had to come up with a strong argument which brought forward the climate resilience and benefit to it. So what is in it for them? I think articulating it from a point of view of specific benefits at a scheme level, specific benefit at an actionable item level, which they understand was very, very critical for us. And I think that conversation led us to working with them very closely on reviewing, and Vivek sitting here led that review for us, and it was it helped the governments and the executives internalize it on a day-to-day basis when they were looking at the budgets or schemes and plans. The other example that I would take is from Assam, where we had to look at a completely different perspective to get them talking about mainstreaming climate change in various budgets. Assam as a government was very much interested in SDGs. They have an SDG action plan and they wanted to fulfill it. So for us, the experts and the other experts in the room, it was essential for us to explain to them how allocating money for adaptation would actually help deal with sustainable development goals and deliver on those goals. And suddenly we had a lot of interest from them to work on it and start looking at mainstreaming their budgets and allocating more money for climate change. So, so to just quickly summarize and move on, I think the articulation from a point of view of any issue, a subject, a matter that is in high demand or is a high priority for the government, and bringing in the climate change relevance and benefit is critical to begin the conversation. And simplifying the entire process and demystifying climate change and using simple, agricultural benefit, water resource benefit, or water balance, or the terminologies that they are more comfortable with, and doing the back-end adaptation calculation ourselves during implementation phase is the other important thing that we thought was that it helped us in 6 out of 11 locations where we dabbled with it. And the last is to be able to highlight what they're already doing and listing it as climate change adaptation benefit. And that brings in a bit of motivation for them to start engaging. And then being able to connect the dots with, the various benefits an irrigation scheme can actually bring for climate change adaptation, which they weren't aware of. So that then also motivates the department to, it's an added feather in their cap. So they are sort of more thrilled in mainstreaming and working on it. I think I'll stop for the moment at that.
Thank you very much, Vidya. So then we'll move to Shri Sunil Kumar from the General Manager, Farm Sector Policy Department of NABARD. And NABARD plays a really important role in the climate finance architecture of India. Perhaps you can give us a little bit of insight to your experience of the challenges there are for mainstreaming climate finance to leverage the development investment and the private investment that could be more delivering better resilience outcomes, but also the challenges of accessing the climate finance globally.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm happy to be here before you. I come from NABARD, and I look after the climate change vertical of NABARD. As she has already mentioned, NABARD is the national implementing entity for 3 important funds: Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change. And in total, we are currently implementing 35 projects. These are all climate change projects. Out of 34 projects are adaptation projects. So under Adaptation Fund, we are doing 6 projects. Adaptation Fund projects are implemented through NGOs. Under National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change, we are implementing 27 projects. And under GCF, 2 projects have been sanctioned. And the Odisha project is likely to start. Already inception workshops have been done. And the fund flow from GCF is likely to commence by end of this month. So, apart from these climate projects, NABARD, through its own resources also, we are implementing a number of projects which are in the nature of climate projects. We have a very interesting program which is called Umbrella Program on Natural Resource Management, which basically deals in what is called blended finance. So this program we are implementing in collaboration with KfW and GIZ. And this program is also being implemented largely through NGOs, where NABARD provides loan cum grant for small sustainable projects which are managed by community. So and there are a number of very interesting learning outcomes which have emerged from this program. About 300 projects have been supported under this. So based on our experience of implementing climate projects, some of the challenges that we have encountered, I'll share with you. First of all, the stakeholders that we deal in, state government departments, Panchayati Raj institutions, banks, the level of awareness regarding issues relating to climate change, that is very low. Then the identification of vulnerable sectors, vulnerable interventions, etc., that also is a challenge. So many times we get proposals which actually are kind of run-of-the-mill kind of proposals, which are business-as-usual proposals. They do not target at the vulnerable climate vulnerability issues. Then the generation of quality proposal is also a very large issue, major issue. The proposal that we get from the government departments, they need to be kind of fine-tuned several times. There are data gaps, and it takes a long time to make it fit for submission to the fund. Then at the level of implementation, we face challenge in terms of lack of coordination between the nodal department and the actual executing department. Most of the states, the forest department or the environment department happens to be the nodal department, whereas the projects, adaptation projects relate to mainly agriculture. It could be livestock sector, it could be water resource sector. So the coordination between the forest department and agriculture department, for example, that's a problem area, and that actually leads to delay in project implementation. What we find is that so far in India, largely the adaptation projects are being supported through government grant, and also through budgetary resources. We are of the view that private sector and banks, they have a very huge role to play in supporting adaptation projects. So there is a need to have a blended finance product, and we are working on this. Then mainstreaming of adaptation finance in the development planning and credit planning is very important. You may be aware that from NABARD side, we prepare what is called potential linked credit plan for all the districts in the country every year. So now what we have started doing is that for each sector, for example, plantation and horticulture, animal husbandry, poultry, we try to identify the climate risk which is associated with the particular sector, and what could be the mitigation kind of measures which could reduce the impact of climate change in these sectors. And those interventions also we are spelling out in the plan document. And wherever it is possible, we are also giving projections, credit projections. That means some of the activities can be supported by banks. So we identify those projects, and we give the model projects in terms of its economics, what could be the repayment period, etc. So these are the challenges that we have faced in a nutshell. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So, okay, so we've now had the perspective from mainstreaming into government programs, and then really the nodal organisation for accessing and supporting the process of structuring the climate finance. So if we could hear from Sangeeta Agrawal, the Senior Sector Specialist for Natural Resources Management with KfW, a little bit about how the development banks, whether that's a bilateral in your case or other bilateral actions, could really support the process of mobilising this finance.
Thank you, Claire, and good afternoon to all. So I'm not sure if everyone is very familiar with KfW, because we are pretty low-key development bank, but we represent the government of Germany, and we bring in the bilateral financial cooperation funding into India. We also have a sister organization called GIZ, which is responsible for technical cooperation in India, across the world. So globally, German government has been very committed to the climate change debate, and just to give you an idea of the kind of funding that we are putting in 2017, the German government has put in about euro 3.65 billion euros from its official budget funds into climate change, and this includes both mitigation as well as adaptation. And in addition to that, KfW brought in another 4.5 billion euros of financing for projects related to climate and environmental protection. And just to tell you how KfW is able to raise this amount of money is that KfW is a AAA rated promotional bank in Germany. And we basically, the budget funds that we get from the government of Germany is basically leveraged to be able to raise more money from the markets. And so we are able to offer a much larger quantum of money as concessional loans. But besides the concessional loans that KfW provides, we also provide significant amount of grant funding and equity as well as guarantee funds. Besides the official development aid which comes into the country, another very important source of financing for us are the various other German ministerial financing which is available, like the International Climate Initiative, which is primarily, the objective is to finance innovative and innovative institutional programs or innovative technologies across the country. In India, KfW has been active for the last 60 years, and till date, we have brought in financing of about 16.74 billion euros, and currently our main areas of financing are in energy, urban infrastructure, and the natural resource management programs. Out of this whole volume of funding, I would say about 24% of our money goes for adaptation programs. However, for us, it's very difficult, and as some of our speakers earlier said, that it is very difficult to exactly pinpoint what is the funding which is going only for adaptation, climate adaptation. And this is a struggle which we kind of face when we do our project design, because the understanding, since our mandate is primarily to work with governments and with public sector entities, we find that the level of understanding of what exactly is climate change is very minimal. And it's very difficult to really come up with first solid ideas which can then be measured to really identify that this is an adaptation benefit which is coming in. So that's a huge constraint, I find. Also, one of the key things that we do before designing any program is to do a climate vulnerability analysis. A very big drawback which I find in most of the assessments that we find, similar to what Mr. Kumar said, is we have a very limited resource within the country. So it's the same people who are doing climate vulnerability analysis for the last 10 years. And the results are all similar. You know, we are not able to come up with new things and new innovative ideas. So this is a huge constraint, I find. The kind of, the state action plans of climate change, if you see, they're very, it's not gone beyond the development debate. So what I'm trying to say is, where do we draw the line between development and where does adaptation really start remains to be a huge point to be still demystified, you know. So apart from that, I would also say that all our programs that we are now developing in the natural resource management sector, climate change assessments are a very key component of our assessments. And most of these programs are now aligned to the National Action Plan of Climate Change, as well as relevant state action plans, because we do have a lot of state-based programs. An example, I can say that we have done some work with NABARD on how we looked at the watersheds, and we've done an exercise of climate proofing the existing watersheds. And ours was just an exercise on a very small level. This was grant financed. It's only a 15 million euro program. But what NABARD has done is they've taken on the process and mainstream it to their larger watershed development fund. So NABARD has much larger financing possibilities than what we are able to bring in. And that has been a big learning, the process that we have developed as to how to look at a watershed, how do you conduct an analysis of how to make it more climate resilient, that has now been integrated in across the country wherever they are implementing their watershed programs. Maybe I will take in more later on.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so some of the challenges I'm hearing are common. We'll turn now to Chandrajit Singh as a private sector climate finance expert. How similar are those challenges to what you're facing in the private sector, and how are we going to get that private sector investment getting into adaptation at the scale we need?
Sure. Thank you, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I respond to Claire's questions, just a quick context setting. We can broadly classify the climate investments into adaptation into three domains. First is agriculture, second is business, and third is the industry. So agriculture has been discussed in detail by Mr. Kumar. So I'll focus more on the other two, which is primarily the business and the infrastructure domain. I primarily see two challenges mainly in terms of leveraging, you can say, the private sector private sector finance into climate adaptation investments. Firstly, there is a lack of understanding in the investor community in terms of what is the advantages which will come on the table from the incremental capex which is being incurred in terms of making the assets climate resilient. The only number what they have in the...
CJ, can you translate your language, capex being a capital investment as opposed to a recurrent investment?
Okay. So yeah, I'll just go into more detail on the individual points. So I think I'll manage to explain everything what is. So what the number what sits in the financial model is the cost as of now, which is the capital expenditure. What is missing is the benefits and advantages. So the investors are not making a well-informed decision. That's point number one. Point number two is there's a lack of depth and breadth in the Indian financial markets, especially when we talk of the bonds, insurance, and also the pension funds. And these are the three asset classes which have a very long-term horizon in terms of their investment mandate. And these asset classes are well placed in terms of making any investments which are primarily for climate adaptation. There's another one more point which I'll briefly touch upon and will end up at that particular point. There are some torchbearers of the climate agenda, and I see them giving very conflicting messages to the investors and to the other stakeholders. It could be primarily because of their lack of understanding, or they are being driven by their certain self-objectives. But in the whole process, they are confusing the investors, and they are making things more complicated and not very beneficial for the climate agenda. So I think it's good for the such torch bearers to stand out and say that, okay, we will work more collaboratively in a collaborative manner in order to bring the success to the agenda. I'll give some more color to the first 2 points which I mentioned. When we talk of the infrastructure, we know that India is an emerging economy. Most of the infrastructure is owned by the government. In the last 2 decades, there has been an effort in terms of bringing the private sector into the infrastructure space. New models were carved in, the BOT, BOOT, BOLT. In 2016, a new financial model was brought into place, and that's primarily HAM, the hybrid annuity model. The key objective of bringing that model was the banks were finding it difficult to lend to the private sector in the infrastructure domain because a lot of NPAs were taking place, and the projects were not giving the return which were earlier anticipated. In the new model, which is the HAM, 40% of the capital investment is coming from the government. 20% is the equity which will be brought in by the EPC player, and the remaining 40% is the debt, which will be raised by the private company, which is the EPC player. But the key point here is the ownership of the asset, and which is a big change from the previous models wherein the ownership was vesting with the private sectors. Here, the ownership of the asset is primarily vesting with the government. So the private sector, the lenders, everybody is finding it easy in terms of financing this. The other point which is coming out here, if the infrastructure in this country, the ownership is with the government, the policy maker is the government, then the agenda with respect to integrating climate adaptation should start at the top level in the government. The second point, if we look from the perspective of the private players and the investor community, they see that they are funding the government in terms of building the infrastructure of this country. And to them, their investments are secured because they are giving the money to the government. And on the top of it, the assets which are being financed, these are secured by insurance. Having said that, the investors are still making decisions because there is less money on the table and there are more projects. So the investors are making decisions in terms of what they want to finance, which projects they want to choose. And unfortunately, they are making the decision, as I pointed out earlier, based on not fully informed choices, because the decision or because the data with respect to the advantages which will come from the incremental capex of adding the climate resilience is missing from their financial models. So they are not making the well-informed decision. In such a situation, what I think is the think tanks have a major role to play, and that's where I personally believe that the programs being run by the FIT and KFW and the ACT program has played a key role and can continue to play a major role in terms of, you can say, hand-holding in terms of educating, first the investor community and the government. Second is primarily bringing the experts on table in terms of capacity building. And third is pushing the agenda through the different stakeholders. Now I'll come to my point number 2, which is the lack of depth in the Indian market, especially the key instruments which are required to fund the infrastructure and the investor, you can say the businesses. Therein, there have been some developments which have been taking place, and I'll just like to highlight those developments. Firstly, I will talk about the bonds. The Indian market from bond perspective is not as well developed as to any of the, you can say, the Western world. There's a lot which needs to be done, and what I see is the government taking the right steps in that direction. Government in the last 12 to 18 months have come up with certain suggestions and recommendations, and one of them is that for the large corporates which have long-term borrowings in excess of 100 crores. So those corporates are mandated or will be mandated in terms of raising 25% of this loan through the bond market. And that's a very big change from what historically it has been. Invest in bonds which were either AAA rated or AA rated. Now that has changed. The government want to increase the size of the market, and they have ask the institutional investors in terms and giving the permission that they can even invest in bonds with the A grade rating. The third thing which is happening is the financial regulators are trying to bring in something called as the bond tap, which will give in the flexibility to the corporates to raise money at their own wish. They can decide on the timing and at a much cheaper administrative cost to what has been in the past. And the fourth big step which has been taken in this regard is, you can say, the dispensation with the debenture distribution reserve. That's the another big step, because some portion of the money was supposed to be put in a reserve, which can't be used by the corporates who have raised the bonds, and was more like a security mechanism. So there is a possibility of dispensations which is being proposed, and if that proposal goes through, I think that will be another big boost for the bond market in the country. Last but not the least, is a big step which has come is the IBC, which is the Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Code. That is going to bring in a lot of transparency with respect to the relationships between the banks, their financial positions, and with the corporates. I think that is the wishful defaulters I'm sure will be finding it very hard to absorb, or finding it very hard actually to absorb this code. And that's where is a big change which is happening in terms of making the whole market transparent. Going into the insurance product, which is the second product in terms of long-term financing, and wherein the climate adaptation is a long-term financing, so that's an important, you can say, the product. In the insurance market, some developments which took place, they were many years back, which was primarily bringing in the private sector and opening the market to the foreign investors. The two major developments of the past 2 or 3 years have been the government, you can say, boosting the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, and the second is the Ayushman insurance plan. These are the two developments. Why these two developments are happening is because the government is paying the premium for insuring. One is 100 million of low-income families in the country for their health benefits, and second is the farmers. And if you look to the size of premium which is being paid, the agriculture premium given by the government alone in the last year was more than 25,000 crores. And this is only for 30% of the farmers. If 50 or 60% of the farmers in the Ayushman scheme totally gets capitalized in the next 2-3 years, there will be 1 lakh crore of money on the table with the insurance companies. And that's the money which will flow into the adaptation, or a portion of that money will flow into the climate adaptation domain. The third thing which I mentioned was primarily on the pension side. Pension side has, the state of affairs in India is relatively not that great. Out of 100 people employed in the country, only 9 have a pension scheme, which means there is a huge potential in the market. And the only development what we have seen in the past 2-3 years, and which is basically, we can say in the past 20 years, nothing has happened. So in the 2-3 years, what we have seen is the private sector players were brought into the ambit of national pension scheme. And therein, the benefit which has been given to the people in terms of the tax benefit is the driver for all these private sector players to start putting in money into the NPS. So the market in terms of the pension and insurance, there's a significant potential which can be capitalized by the government in the coming years, and that's the money which will come on the table in terms of driving the climate adaptation space. So I'll stop at that. Happy to dig into more later.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, that certainly gives a sense of where we should be looking to get the private sector interested in some of the regulatory changes that might incentivize them to work with us more. So if I could now move to Nanki Kaur, who's the Regional Programme Manager at ISIMOD for Resilience, and ask you to, having heard from all of these different perspectives, what do you see as the opportunity to begin to bring these views together and really get the finance moving for adaptation?
Thank you, Claire. Good afternoon. My sort of job is to think about how we can bring together the public sector investors and the private sector investors, whether they are the sort of longer term institutional investors or the shorter term project developers or households. How do you bring them together to really sort of deliver the scale of finance that's required for adaptation, to improve the quantity and the quality of finance into adaptation? So this is sort of the need for a strategic coalition. Is we've heard a lot about there is an emerging sort of aligned interest in adaptation, but for that to get converted into a strategic coalition, there'll need to be greater alignment between the investors and much more sort of joint action in the ways that these actors are investing in adaptation. So my sort of points are around three areas. The first area is looking at the types of coalitions that we see emerging around adaptation action. So from some of the work that we've done, and Aditya, this is sort of looking at the political economy of why actors come together. We've sort of seen that different investors come together either because they have or they don't have a policy mandate to work together. It could be to do with their capabilities, which includes their systems that allow them to work with different actors or not. And very often it's also to do with path dependency, who you're used to working with or what your systems allow you to work with. So keeping this in mind, from some of the work we've done, we've seen two types of coalitions emerge. So the first one would focus more on investors coming together based on their choice of financial instruments or how they will deliver finance. So you see sort of a set of actors coming together around being able to access different sources of finance, but have more limited ability of how they deliver that finance. So a lot of the multilateral banks can mobilize money from different sources, but their ability to then get that to the local level or to very small scale actors is limited. You then have a set of investors who have the ability to mobilize money from single sources of finance, like your bilateral agencies or national governments, and they have a few more options of how they get that money out. And the third one within this is investors who can access many different sources of finance, but can also use many different channels to get that money out. So those are the sort of climate funds and a lot of the national financial institutions. So that's a sort of set of coalition around the type of instruments. And if you look at it in another way, you also see people coming together in terms of what types of adaptation investment they prefer. So whether that is investing in public good creation or private good creation, or whether it's investing in institutional capacity or infrastructure or technology, investors tend to collate around different choices. So that's the sort of types of coalitions that we see out there. But we all work in adaptation, and we know that sort of adaptation investments, they do require a sort of portfolio approach of investment. You can't just invest in infrastructure without the institutions. So you need that portfolio of investment. And once you do start investing in adaptation, you also need to grow that investment. So it might be great that we've done sort of pilots of how you integrate climate risk management into social protection. But that investment itself needs to be scaled out. And there are lots of investments that can also become mature assets and leverage private finance into them. So for that is where I think you need to bridge different investors behind a common understanding of what an adaptation investment is. And some of the work that we are doing here with ICRG is looking at sort of Manrega, the example we've been talking about, and how that provides an example. So there are 2 or 3 things within the program, the first one being sort of the policy coherence. So within this program, investment under Manrega, the 6 billion that everybody talks about, is aligned to some of the investments under the national climate change missions to create climate resilient infrastructure. So that's one way of pooling domestic sources. Within Manrega, we are also trying to look at how you can sequence different financial instruments. So if you're starting with climate finance to sort of pilot all this climate resilient infrastructure, how do you then use development or insurance to start implementing that? And could any of these assets, these rural infrastructure assets, actually leverage bonds is a question, but why not? So that's one example of how a sort of strategic coalition is coming together between different actors to scale up investment in rural adaptation assets. And my closing point is around looking at the examples or what we are seeing around coalitions for resource mobilization. I've put down four things that can enable a strategic coalition. The first one, I think almost the entire panel has spoken about. There is a need to have a much better understanding of what is the return on investment when we talk about investing in adaptation. So that's a big gap in this area, but that will play a big role in bringing different actors together and also informing investors when to come in, one after the other. The second one that we are seeing quite a lot, that's already in this place, is sort of the policy coherence. That's policy direction to invest in adaptation. That does encourage investors to come together and align their interests in a particular area, and that's something we see more action on. The third one is to put in place institutional coordination mechanisms to actually bring different investors together. So in this, I think we've seen more action on sort of institutional mechanisms that help you pool resources, but I think we need to see more action on institutional mechanisms that can help you aggregate your different instruments or your investment. So that's something that I think only some of the banks are doing when you're talking about green bonds, how you bring different investors together. And the last one, I think, is an exciting space to watch in terms of an enabling environment. And that is possibly the role that's going to be played by fintech or financial technology, and how that can bring different investors together. So whether that's the use of digital data and whether that will support better decision making or investor choices, or if you're talking about digital lending platforms, which can actually provide, for example, banks a way out of their path dependency on the systems they use to manage money, because they can actually sort of partner with new financial actors to deliver the scale of finance that's required. So that's it from me, Claire.
Claire, can I just take 2 minutes and build on that example?
Okay, very quickly, because I'm going to open it up to the floor, but please, Vidya, very...
Sorry to take but just because she spoke about return on investment, policy instrumentation, institutional coherence, and finally fintech, I couldn't resist. But I have to give you an example. So in Bihar, we've been working for about 3-4 years now on trying to address flood management as a very big issue, and also agriculture and other problems. And sediment emerged as one of their critical banes. Going back to what I said before, we completely flipped the argument for entry point, and we looked at sediment as an opportunity. And now we have an elaborate portfolio. So we have an investment plan to use the sediment through 5 large-scale commercial usage, from roads, embankments, bricks, ceramics, and other sort of commercial utilization, to a sort of a package on policy which looks at sediment management framework, sediment management policy, and specifically even looking at creating a special purpose vehicle or bringing in the various departments to come together, because roads would mean it'll not remain within just the water resources department, but then looking at specific tools, as she was talking about the standard operating SOP for flood management, including sediment management into that. And this whole package then has greatly interested, for instance, ADB to talk about extending their roads and bridges credit line to start investing in sediment management, whereby Bihar government is also willing to co-finance and bring in money. Now, it is not a climate change adaptation program at all anymore for the Bihar government, right from the top level. It's more about, a social sort of livelihood program. Every year every district spends more money on relief and rescue of flood. So it's about saving on all of that money. So, the whole argument just suddenly is flipped and moved. So I was very happy she spoke about the 4 things.
Good. So your ideas have already been validated, Nanki. So that seems to be moving us into consensus quite quickly. So if I open it up to the floor, I mean, what I thought I'd do is ask you all to be really quick, because we did start late and we're going to run out of time. And we'll take a few points or questions, and then let the panel sort of sum up in response as well. But if you could say your name and a tweet-length comment.
Let me not go
So any hands? Yeah, please.
It is nice to hear that Manrega program was used for for funding the adaptation in climatic adaptation. But similarly, there are many other funds available at the village level and panchayat level. Why it was not tapped other funds? Why it was confined to only up to Manrega?
Okay, we'll take that to the panel will take that at the end. Any other comments or questions from the floor?
I'm Mike Toman from the World Bank HQ in Washington. There's a thread that runs through the comments from, Action on Climate Today, Mr. Singh, our private sector colleague, and also the ISIMOD comments. I want to try to draw it out very briefly because I think it's really important. Public resources can be used to move governments. Oftentimes, adaptation funding isn't aligned with where the real needs are. Private sector actors have trouble figuring out what the return is, and the focus ends up being more on the costs. And we need to be thinking about ways to, in effect, find the roles, respectively, of public and private financing. I personally think we should refer less to blending finance and more to looking at its complementarity. Government can do everything from getting rid of building height restrictions so that the private sector can build taller buildings and people don't sleep in floodplains, the poor, and among many other examples. I think that there has to be something that catalyzes government policy change, and that may be the best single use of the private funds. One of the speakers mentioned that too often the money from the GCF or other sources goes to projects, and I think that's exactly right. I think it should go to strategies and removal of barriers, because then I think you're going to get the private funding, and if you don't, you probably won't.
Great, a good additional challenge there to our thinking. This gentleman and then you, yeah.
So I have two questions. The first question is that we are saying that there will be a lot of money available through pension funds and the insurance funds, but why the fund managers will be interested in the investment in the such type of the risky areas where no ROE is not clear? It's one of the questions to Mr. Singh. And another question is there that here we are more interested in the institutional framework and the government, but we are not talking about an entrepreneur who is starting an enterprise, and where he can get a fund from equity fund or the loan, mostly related to the and project he is dealing with the climate change.
Great, and this gentleman here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Well, I'm Dr. Hemant Badola, advisor to the Honorable Chief Minister's Office in Sikkim. We have experience in Sikkim. For example, adaptation through greenery. This is one of the biggest adaptation to the, withstanding climate change and sustainability. Here, in terms of the finance is very important, but at the same time, if you have that kind of the political willingness and very good tool to mobilize people, even the panchayat level, whatever they have, the small fund or Manrega, and it is a kind of blend of the different approaches. It is not the only finance, but just I'm giving one example that there's a 10 minutes to Earth. This was a program many years back. It was started in Sikkim, and then everyone, whether it is government official or the people or the panchayat people or the rural villagers, they all will plant at a particular time. 10 minutes they will give to the earth, and they will plant lakhs of trees. So there was no funding required, much funding required. So that kind of the motivation, sometimes it helps, but largely it is a kind of the management, mobilization, and the political enthusiasm. So that is one very important mantra. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll just let the panelists respond to some of those. don't feel that you have to respond to all of them. In fact, in some ways, I'd like you to pick the thing you're most keen to respond to. Is there anything you want to respond to, Sangeeta? And I'll make sure they all get covered.
I actually thought what Mr. Toman said was very interesting because one of the things that we feel and we kind of like to be very careful of when we do our project designs is dependence on the grant funds, and that's because we feel that there's this whole debate about adaptation should be grant financed, and we just feel that what is important is to get the people out of the poverty and to build their resilience, and therefore not to be dependent on outside funding. So one has to be very careful about what is important is to build a capacity for the farmer to be able, or farmer or in a small business enterprise, to be able to finance that activity, whatever is the source of income, on their own esteem, And so that's where the blended financing comes in. I think it's very important. And what we need to do is create something like a risk mitigation fund, maybe, which will support them for their efforts, which will bring in the insurance the basic insurance should always be there, but something like which is not covered by a basic insurance. When you have an NPA, there could be a climate-related activity. So that's where the risk mitigation kicks in. That's something that in India we've tried very hard to push for a risk mitigation fund for the agriculture sector, but that's something like GCF should probably bring in for financing. That's where the grant money should be put in for.
Thank you. CJ,
Yeah.
your thoughts?
I'll pick up on the questions with respect to why will the money go into the adaptation projects. See, I mentioned about two things. One is there's a lack of capacity, a lack of understanding in the investor community. That's point number one. And which brings on table the need in terms of engagement with the investor community and capacity building at their end. And that, in fact, does not mean that it is only these, the project finance manager or the investors which I'm talking of. That also means there are certain technical experts who give them the feed-in. So there is a capacity building requirement at those project engineers levels, project designers who give technical expertise and inputs to the investors. And that's where, when I referred to the program which the Act is running, and Aditya mentioned about the amount of engagement and the capacity building they have done at the government level, I'm talking of another two segments where the capacity building is required and which somebody will have to do it. And because that's then only the benefits with respect to the incremental capital expenditure which is being incurred in terms of making the project's climate resilience will start to make sense to the investors. Currently, what they look at is only the cost side of the thing, and there is no advantage which is coming on the table in terms of their analysis, and that has to be brought in, and that's where the hand-holding is required. The second thing which I mentioned is there is less money chasing more projects. And when the money supply increases, certainly the choice with investors will also go up. In the interim, they will start to better understand the advantages of climate adaptation, that how that will help them in the longer run, how that will change the ROI or IRR of the projects, and that is a more like a win-win scenario. That's why more money on the table will start to change their perception also.
Great. Go on then, Aditya, but very quick because we're running out of time.
So, Charanjit, just to follow up on that, what is the incentive here? Like, I guess the question is, if the return on investment is not clear, and if the methodologies, as Nanki's pointed out, are not on the table, then I think the question still stands, right? What is the incentive for someone managing a big pension fund to invest in adaptation?
See, it is, there are multiple things here. One is that if you're talking of a pension fund, they already have a long-term investment horizons, right? If you go into a short-term investment, then there's an asset liability mismatch, which this fund managers don't want to enter into the domain. Second is when we are talking of climate adaptation, climate resilience, we are talking of a long-term time frame. Let's take an example, right? We have seen in the past 5 years, number of floods which have happened, and a lot of infrastructure in states of, especially in, you can say in the coastal states, Andhra, Orissa, yeah, even to that extent we saw floods in Chennai, we have seen floods in Uttaranchal where the entire infrastructure was washed off. So somebody is funding it, that infrastructure. So where is that money coming from? And there's the investors' money which was there, it was the government which was there, and there was the money from the insurance companies which was on the table because those assets were secured because they were under the construction. So there was some sort of comfort in terms of to the banks and all this stuff. If in few years' time, right, let's say when we're talking about the pension fund and he has put in money into an asset which is not climate resilient, there's a good chance that asset might get washed off. And that asset is generating revenue for that pension fund manager. So he is more concerned about the revenue which is coming from that asset. So he will like to have an asset which can give him a security of the revenues. And that is possible when you start building in the climate resilience for those assets. And that's where, and as I see, there are a lot of things where the human behavior is guided towards. Today, the investors are more concerned about his quarterly bonus. That's a fact of the life, or his annual bonus, right? When you start changing their compensation structure in terms of their long-term perspective, they will also start to think in terms of the longer-term return, right? And that's where he will start to factor in all these parameters which give him a surety of return from a long-term perspective. Otherwise, his own self-benefits will be at a risk. So you need to do a lot of changes in the entire structure in terms of bringing in the agenda of climate resilience. And it's not an easy job, it's a complicated job, but I do understand it is feasible. That's why I said, I also made the deliberate point saying that some of the people are doing a disadvantage by sending very conflicting messages, where they're confusing the people, some saying this is not good, some saying this is very good. So I'll stop it.
Great. Okay. So, do you want to handle any of those questions or any thoughts that have been stimulated?
There was one issue relating to GCF which was made regarding financing the project rather than the strategies or the programs. I fully agree with this observation. I'll also like to make one point which was made by Aditya in the first presentation only. The requirement of adaptation in India is huge, and the possibility of the international funds taking care of our requirement is very, very limited. Even if it takes care of 5%, I'll be very happy. So if you look at GCF, GCF has to take care of 190 countries. And on their priority, the small island developing countries, they're at the top. LDCs are there. And then it is followed by developing countries. And among developing countries also, India is one of the stronger economies. So maximum support that we can expect from GCF will be at most 1 or 2 projects in a year. That's it. And which will be a very, very small amount compared to our requirement.
And therefore the need to look at every source that we can find. So Vidya, any thoughts? I'm afraid these are actually final thoughts, I've realised, having checked the time.
No, I think I've already done.
So there's one question that came up. There's a couple of questions, and maybe the two of you could, between you, cover one of them each. One was, why NREGs? Why are we worrying about NREGs when there's all these other sources of finance at the local level? And the other was the importance of, I suppose in some ways it's that leadership, motivating, mobilizing, getting the whole of society involved in the response. Go on, take leadership, Vidya. We both agree you should handle that one.
I think I should agree to the fact that we need to mobilize a lot of leadership. And again, I'll have to go back to Bihar example and say that our experience with Bihar at least, and probably in other places also, that's how it will be, to get the Deputy Chief Minister and the Chief Minister interested massively and show leadership towards the program. Our task was to talk about the issue that mattered to them most, which was siltation, but from a perspective of climate change adaptation, which mattered to us most. And there we had the leader by us, supporting all the initiatives and going ahead and creating that sort of momentum that was required. But what is also very critical is, I think, one of the pieces that we did in Bihar, which I'll allude to as an example, is leadership from the last affected community, the sort of frontline community to climate change. I think if we are able to bring their, their viewpoint, and not lose it through the whole process of bringing it up to a big policy articulation, and embed that as the sort of critical driving force, that also then encourages a lot of political movement, but also private sector and other sort of actors, bureaucratic leadership to make that change. And from a different program of mine, which I would like to say, I think connecting the dots and being able to make it extremely relevant to any particular person, we create a lot of climate change champions who then spearhead and lead the work for us. So, I think.
Thank you. Final words.
Before Manrega, I think first, congratulations, sir, on Sikkim, on its leadership of being the first organic state.
Yeah,
yes.
the world. Yeah.
And on Manrega, it's the second largest budget item. We could look at defense. But on a more serious note, you're right, there are lots of other programs which offer adaptation benefits, and those are being looked at. A lot of the work that focuses on Manrega is actually recognizing the scale of the program, both in terms of the resources, but also in terms of its reach. It's a program that's implemented across India, and it also targets those who are most vulnerable, and a lot of people who do rely on sort of climate-sensitive livelihoods. So that's one of the reasons why there is quite a big focus on how this program can also deliver resilience to climate change, given that it has been quite effective in addressing other shocks to vulnerable communities, be that poverty or marginalization. So that's one of the reasons why there's such a big focus on this program.
Great. Any final words? Okay, so I'm going to try. I'm standing between you. I'm sitting between you and your tea break. So I'm going to just try and summarize some of what I heard from our panel of experts and also from the earlier interventions. I heard very clearly the value and the importance of us explaining better what this climate thing is about in the right terms, in the terms that make sense for others, but being explicit about it so we can say what's additional and what the additional benefit is, not just the additional cost. That we need to be more innovative, not just come up with the same old, from a couple of people. And that one of the ways we can be more innovative would be to be collaborating and beginning to learn each other's languages between the development actors, the climate actors from different spheres, and the investors, the private investors in particular. But we shouldn't just be trying to blend our different financing, being more complementary, looking for more complementarity, sequencing and layering. So thinking about that in terms of the finance, but also in terms of the interventions that will really support the very poorest people, but to help them, if we can begin to govern climate risk more coherently, then they'll begin to pivot more faster to new opportunities and to green jobs. So it's a win-win. But we have a very small amount of time. So I guess my final thought would be we should really focus then on this catalyzing the policy change, removing barriers and getting those more innovative financing mechanisms moving. So thank you all very much for joining us. And could I ask you all to thank the panel?